So next up we have Joan Garvan. Joan's thesis, Maternal Ambivalence in Contemporary Australia, Navigating Equity and Care, is in Sociology and Gender. She has a homepage at Maternal Health and Wellbeing, offered online professional development courses, and worked as an advocate for improved early years services. Joan is an inaugural member of the Association for Research on Mothering, now Maternal Scholars Australia, and has presented papers at all of the 10 conferences in Australia, along with 2 in Canada, 1 in New York and 1 in Florence, organised by the Motherhood Initiative for Research and Community Development. She is currently on the board for Maternal Health Matters. Joan has worked as a tutor on gender and development and lectured on Introduction to Sociology. So welcome, Joan.
Yeah, after giving all those papers, I was determined to speak to my paper instead of reading it. So I hope I managed to do that. I've still got too many notes, but that's my aim. And I want to be conscious of the people online. So yeah, my research, which I graduated in 2010, so a fair while ago, and I was amazed when I read a book more recently that was published more recently, and I didn't know so many of the references. So it's just great to see that there's a whole lot more research happening. And in those days, in the early 2000s, there really wasn't much talk about matrescence. It was all about transition of parenting. And so I brought together an international body of research on transition of parenting, as did Belinda, did work on that as well. And one of the things that I keep going back to is a study that was by the European Union, and it was 8 countries through Europe. It was quantitative and qualitative, so, a very extensive study. And in their findings, they talked about how does motherhood and fatherhood, how are they different? And among their findings was this quote: a frequently recurring theme across the countries is the way in which gender shapes parenthood and makes motherhood different from fatherhood, both in everyday life and in the workplace. The transition to parenting, or you could say matrescence, appears to be a critical tipping point on the road to gender equality. And I've taken that. Once I finished, I wasn't trying to get a job in universities or anything. I thought, well, I haven't done 5 years of this study for nothing. So, and I kind of was 60 when I finished, so I wasn't really looking for a career either, but I wanted to do something with the research. So and I had a bit of an activist background, so that was my tendency to be an activist. And I looked for ways where I could work with people. And I thought, maternal and child health nurses, they work with women in those early years. They're a natural ally. But to be honest, I was amazed at how many barriers I came across. Really, still today, and I know this from people who work in the field, maternal and child health nurses, although there's always good people, but really the system is about infants and children. It's not really, they'll ask questions about depression, and they'll ask, maybe they'll ask about your relationship if you've got a good person, but really it's about infants and children, about the well-being of infants and children. So they weren't, and to be honest, I was amazed at some of the conferences. They were really about products. Maybe it's changed. That was a while ago. I've been at conferences where, to be honest, I went away really angry. The Marseille conference was one. I couldn't believe it. There was actually one of the keynote speakers gave a talk to the audience, which was mostly women, about how men are missing out on sex in the first year after the birth. And I didn't know, I was kind of speechless, but thankfully someone got up and had a few words with him about it. And it was really great to see there are other people really angry about it too, but so disappointing. Reason for being for me is that maternal health is a social and cultural event that's been highly medicalised. The experience of matrescence is a significant event, I think, in our lives, of anything. As some other people have said, it changes our lives in a really fundamental way that you wouldn't believe until it happens to you, I think. I think it's really difficult for anyone who doesn't become a parent to really understand that connection, especially that connection with the child. And then the expectations in which you have to bring that child up. Something I'm not going to talk about, but is related to that. In my research, I talked about finding a line between self and baby. It's just one way of expressing that connection. But and I used Jessica Benjamin's work on intersubjectivity to talk about those dynamics, bonds of love and like subject, love object are two of her works, which again are kind of probably maybe a bit outdated now, but I found that really useful as a concept to find the mother. There's three main points I want to talk about today. And one is the whole thing about care. It's there is an international movement, and usually it's talked about in terms of unpaid care. And really, unpaid care is a bit of a stand-in, I think, for mother, because it's usually women. Like, you know, obviously there's some men who do it, and there's couples who are changing, pioneers of the future, I call them, and they're managing ways to share the care and all that. But it's not just a matter of couples sharing care. I think it's a matter of our social system. The social system needs to change. One of the references on that list is Martha Feynman, and she wrote a book called The Myth of Autonomy, which again, I think for me, it was great to find that kind of work, because she talks about our philosophical heritage is imbued with this idea of autonomy. Like, you know, someone turned up already dressed and ready for work without acknowledging that they didn't get dressed and ready for work by themselves, that they had to be cared for by someone. And so, you know, there are feminists working within academia who are reworking that tradition. And it was great to see the paper on de Beauvoir today, because that's how far back, how deep these issues go. It's this whole thing about care. It's not just a matter of getting good childcare or getting good aged care, which tend to be feminised industries and low paid, of course, but it's a matter of our social system recognising that both the market and the state rely on care in order to function. So it's very, very deeply ingrained. So that's one point I want to bring up. Two other points in terms of change and advocacy that I looked at. I thought, well, where can I go in terms of trying to affect any change? On that thing about care, I should mention there's an international NGO called Make Mothers Matter, and I really recommend you look at their site, because they get these issues to do with the big picture. They talk about education and health and economy, and they're kind of at that international level. They have online seminars, and it's worthwhile tapping into that. There are people in Australia who talk about it. Elizabeth Broderick with the Human Rights Commission, she had a study on care. She's not there anymore. And it's funny how, you know, somehow or other the issues get buried again. They might come up and they're buried again. So I don't know where Elizabeth Broderick is these days, but I believe our Governor-General, Sam Mostert, I think she is sympathetic to these issues. And I'll reference something later to do with the Labor Party agenda. So the two key points I want to make in terms of change is the maternal and child health system. And the other one is first 1,000 days. And I don't know how many people really have come across much to do with the first 1,000 days. But to me, I think that is a sort of vehicle for anyone who is concerned with change, because the first 1,000 days starts in conception and it goes up to the year 2. And obviously it includes mothers. But the agenda is, I've heard, is really pushed by paediatricians, and it becomes all about the infants and children. How can you talk about infants and children without talking about the mother at least, but also the father and the social context in which that child is growing up? It's just absolutely ridiculous to talk about infants, the health and well-being of infants and children without talking about what they're born into. So they're two key points. And I wanted to raise a question. is matrescence like the canary in the coal field? And is it a tipping point, a critical tipping point on the road to gender equality? During those early years, often, in my research at the time, there was indications that 70% of couples aspired to a form of gender equal or egalitarian family. And yet when they have a child, there's trends towards gendered roles. That happens in those first couple of years. And so I think, I'm kind of convinced, and it'd be interesting to see what anyone else thinks, but is it a critical tipping point on the road to gender equality? And again, from that point of view, the first 2 years, because that's what I focused on, in that first 2 years, I'm looking at maternal and child health system. And because being an advocate and with maternal health matters, there's a lot of issues in hospitals, as probably everyone knows. It was really interesting with the inquiry into birth trauma in New South Wales. There was a lot of women who came forward. I was really surprised because my birth was good, actually, and birth wasn't an issue for me. It didn't raise issues, but it does raise a lot of issues for women. There's a lot of bullying, they say, in hospitals because there's something like 320,000 births a year in Australia. Multiple births right now today across Australia. I don't know if 100 births, but there's a lot of birth babies being born all the time. And so it's one of the most events that happen in hospitals. And so there's a pressure on hospitals to get them in and out. And so there is bullying. Women feel bullied. I've heard stories from women who are teaching at university, and here they are being bullied at hospital because, the nurses, the way they're being treated and all that, they feel they lose their voice. I've even been surprised that, to hear that often the male partner, because of that idea of being the breadwinner and being the protector, I've heard things like there are men who make decisions for their women giving birth. I can't believe that. I find that hard to believe, but apparently it's the case. And I've even heard from women who are managers in hospitals, and this was someone who's a manager, a senior position in one of the hospitals. She said, we need to teach women to speak up for themselves. It's like, aren't they speaking up for themselves? What's happening there? Again, there's a lot of factors that take away women's voice, but that needs to come back to the table. The women have to have, young women need to feel empowered to speak up for themselves and with their birth, and that they're being recognised and having the birth that they want to have. One of the good things about birth trauma reporting, New South Wales at least, they've just been announced that there's been quite good funding coming out. The evidence shows with birth, continuity of care has the best outcomes. Until this report came out, it was only like 8 to 10% of women that were accessing continuity of care. Why is that? Why, when the best outcomes and it wasn't being provided? So there are sort of things happening behind the scenes. There's advocacy groups like Maternity Consumer Network and Maternity Choices, and our group, Maternal Health Matters. There's, you might be pleased to know that there's parliamentary friends of maternal health, and now there's been a series of sessions happening at Parliament where invited speakers to come in and telling politicians, and it is kind of, there are people, Helen Haynes is one, Alicia Payne and Lou O'Brien from Queensland. They're in Parliament and they're on this. So talk to your local members. A lot of women, I find, don't talk to their local members, but if you do have issues with anything, I highly recommend talk to your local member. Actually, that's one reason why we got the maternal friends or parliamentary friends of maternal health, because someone else and I went to talk to our local member, turned out to be Alicia Payne in the ACT, and she's one of the people. She's got young children. She knows that there's a lot of issues. One of the other issues I want to talk about, 1 minute, Oh, wow, that's amazing. And I only took it down to 3 points, but there's so many things that I could talk about. I guess the other thing two things I wanted to mention. One is the first 1,000 days. I recommend look that up. And again, talk to your local member about it should be the mother infant dyad has to be at the centre of that, not just infants and children. There's a mother and there's a family who are part of that first 1,000 days. Babies aren't going to prosper without their mothers and fathers. And I want to mention the federal government have a report on gender equality. It's called Working for Women. It came out in 2024. And they've got 2 priority areas. And I recommend that you look it up because it is quite progressive. One of their priority areas is unpaid care and includes a national strategy for the care and support economy. That's interesting. It's recognised there. There's potential for that to be, fed into. And another priority area is health, including 12 new perinatal mental health centres across Australia. So they're being developed. That was only just last year that came out. Yeah, I think there's lots of work to be done. No wonder women have issues to do with matrescence. It's they're trying to do their best, do it all, and in a system that really isn't helping all that much, pushing things back onto them. So yeah, great to hear all these papers and all the best with your continuing work.